Jolly, we're ready to go. Thank you. So here we are on our next panel, which is Manufacturing Sovereignty, 5G in Focus. And I will frame this discussion just so people are aware of exactly how we're positioning this. But before I do that, let me just introduce here who we have as panelists. So John Duncan. I will do my utmost to remember the whole bio, but basically John was former policy director to Commerce Secretary Guttierez, chief of staff to Elaine Chao, if I'm right, former Labour Secretary, and now runs a research company called Meridian, based out of DC. Accurate? I think we're good. It's factually correct and off the top of my head, so fantastic. Blair Levin, who was on our early digital divides panel, former Chief of Staff to the Federal Communications Commission and Director of the National Broadband Plan. And Jennifer Gerbi, I hope pronounced correctly, who works at ARPA-E, which for those of you who are not familiar is the, if you like, research arm of the Department of Energy, very much similar to DARPA, which I guess was its inspiration in the Department of Defense. And we have brought her here. She's a scientist by training and has a very, very broad remit, associate director, program director there. And I will give some context as to why we've put together this collective of panelists and to get straight into the issue. So the title of the panel is Manufacturing Sovereignty, 5G in Focus. And the focus of the panel is very much to discuss the importance of where manufacturing is happening from a national security perspective, and how the concept being that the West has hollowed out a lot of its capabilities around the whole supply chain and manufacturing chain, whether it be from basic products through to now increasingly more advanced products, obviously particularly to Asia and China within. And we talk about 5G in focus, 5G being one of those exemplars of a critical technology which potentially the US and Europe and the friendly sort of Western allied countries have actually potentially given up, if not necessarily given up, but who are not necessarily in a leadership position on. And this is an example of what our concept of manufacturing sovereignty. It is not the only example. 5G is one, and that's why we bring Jennifer to the table, because within the energy field, particularly things like renewable energy, we're also seeing this issue play out as well, where the US, Europe, and its allies has losing control, if you like, of the DNA of these key emerging technologies of the future. So this is really a very, very important area, and that's why we bring this interesting collective together. John, we know John does a lot of work in 5G, and obviously Blair has lived and breathed telecoms for as long as he can remember. So I will allow you each to give your perspectives, if you like, starting with John, as to the importance of this issue, which is not given sufficiently due attention. Obviously, on the 5G side, Huawei is a notable exception at this point with plenty of coverage, but very little understanding as to how this is going to play out. So, John, if you will, please give a bit of context on your work in this area and your perspectives.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an interesting intersection of topics. I guess maybe some of the things that I would suggest thinking about is that if we're using 5G as a case study for the policymakers in Washington, how they're generally approaching economic issues, there's a strong intersection here as there is in other areas between economic security and national security. On the economic security side, this is a broad-based area that the administration views as being critical from a job growth standpoint. And on the national security side, there is a significant focus on the administration's part, and really in Congress as well, on ensuring that the U.S. is maintaining protection on critical technologies and denying access to those technologies from countries overseas that it's concerned about, primarily China in this case. And the way policymakers on different sides of the aisle approach these two issues somewhat differently, but they all essentially fall into three buckets, maybe four in the case of 5G. But one is, what can the government be doing to subsidize, or they would say maximize investment in these technologies? What can the government be doing to streamline regulations in a way that is going to facilitate more deployment of these technologies? And then what can the government be doing to ensure that there's a national security lens, again, on not violating sensitivity around these technologies? I guess in 5G's case, and I defer to Blair on this, there's a significant additional focus, maybe you could call it regulatory in nature, but in ensuring the efficient utilization of spectrum, and that's its own arena of activity in this particular area. But in each of those three other buckets, you've got what is notable around 5G is that you've got a high degree of bipartisan agreement that 5G is a priority, and that each of these initiatives or each of these buckets should be pursued at some level, and the partisan differences dictate sort of where the emphasis is. But I think what's notable in this case is that, just to highlight a couple of examples, if you think about there's a lot of talk about infrastructure and the need to do infrastructure, and sort of the infrastructure week has become a big joke in Washington as to when the president's going to have his infrastructure week. But if there's one area where there's actually been a deliverable on infrastructure, and this gets to my point about subsidization or maximizing investment, it's been in telecommunications and broadband, and to some degree 5G. This is reflected in a budget deal that was done back in 2018. It was the only dedicated area of infrastructure investment they did back in that budget deal, to the tune of about $600 million. It is the one area that you can point to outside of highways that both sides, when they talk about their grand plans for infrastructure at substantial levels of subsidization, both sides can agree to. So that is a important area where there's commonality between the parties in this area. On streamlining regulations, we see some degree of intersection between the parties as it relates to 5G. Just to highlight some examples, and again, Blair, I'm sure, can talk about this in great detail, but in ensuring the deployment of small cell technology, you've got two ends of the ideological spectrum in Congress championing legislation that would facilitate that at a faster rate. You do see some friction at the FCC around that, but there is some commonality in terms of what the two parties want to see done in terms of deploying 5G technology more aggressively. There's other areas on the deregulatory front. I'll let the other panelists speak in a moment, and maybe we can come back to it, where this administration is putting very significant emphasis on deregulating in a way that facilitates the deployment of these technologies. So really, those are sort of the three buckets: subsidization, deregulation, and the national security sensitivities that are relevant to 5G, and where there is a unique level of partisan alignment that exists in this case that may not exist as much in other areas. So that would be my generic framework for thinking about it. We'll return to some of that.
Go for it.
So I should say my comments on this topic are really informed partly by my experience in the government, but a lot by, over the last 20 years, I've spent a considerable amount of time and can continue to advise Wall Street on the implications of policy. And my comments really reflect that. So as to the quick question on manufacturing, we've already lost it. I mean, that's gone, and it ain't coming back. And so the question is...
so the ship has sailed. That's it.
Pardon?
The ship has sailed.
The ship has sailed. And,
all right.
we're not getting it back.
Okay,
you
interesting.
could look at the breakup of AT&T as a big mistake, 40 years ago as a big mistake in this regard or something. Yeah. Or however many years ago.
And by the way, talking about industrial policy, does that exist?
Well, we absolutely do have we do have an industrial policy. Yeah. In fact, for example, the T-Mobile Sprint deal was approved by the FCC based on an industrial policy of accelerating 5G and a social policy of accelerating deployment to rural America. Okay. Those are two things Republicans are not traditionally known for, but in this particular case, they decided it's good to have an industrial policy and good to have a social policy. We could chat about that. I would just note that there'll be a trial on that case here in New York that has nothing to do with either of those two things and goes back to competition policy. I want to, the big question to me on 5G is, and I think this is the question that we have been debating in Washington, but I think very badly, is There's total bipartisan agreement that we should lead in 5G, as we led in 4G. The question is, what does leadership mean? And on that, we're having a very stupid debate. And I mean that in a variety of different ways I could go into, but let me just take the example you used. 600 million, first of all, that's not much money. When you're talking about, if you look at the Defense Innovation Board, one estimate they had was 400 billion, right, to build out the network. That's using millimeter wave spectrum. But you know, Accenture had a $250 billion, so 600 million isn't much. But the other thing, and this is the important point, that goes only to rural America. I guarantee you this, whether or not America leads in 5G has zero to do with rural America. And so when the president and the chairman of the FCC get up and have a press conference, as they did, and said, we're excited today to make two new announcements to accelerate American leadership in 5G, and yet those two announcements were not new. They have, pardon?
20 billion, not necessarily incremental, but.
No, that wasn't new. That was taking 20 billion from an existing fund, renaming the fund. Labeling. It was totally about labeling. It wasn't about anything new, and it had nothing to do with American leadership. By the way, if you actually look at the metrics they're using, it also has something to do with 5G. So we're actually, and this shouldn't be a liberal or conservative thing. This should be, how do we learn the lessons of America's success with 4G and then apply it in a world of 5G? We're not doing that. In my experience in Washington, there are two kinds of folks, those who want to own a narrative and those who want to own a problem. And what we have now on both sides, and this is a lot to do with media and a lot of other things, we have a lot of discussion about a narrative, but it's not about a problem. And the fundamental problem, and it does go a little bit to manufacturing, which is if we're not going to lead in manufacturing and the deployment of networks, number one, how do we make sure that there's security? It's something we're not really discussing nearly as much as we should in a 5G world. And number two, how do we get those economic benefits of leadership? And it turns out there's a certain kind of table stakes for having a network, but it's fundamentally not about networks. It's fundamentally about operating systems, applications, and other things that really drive the economic growth. And that's not the debate that we're having.
Okay, fascinating. Jennifer, a different perspective, if you like, beyond about 5G, if that's something you're happy to speak to, but also, as I said, more in your domain in the energy world.
Sure. So I'll take this in a slightly different direction, which is to say that it sounds like what you're really talking about are things like supply chain risk and manufacturing risk, and then adjacently security risk.
Yeah.
And this is on. There's nothing special really about 5G in that regard. We face this with many different things
Sure.
that we do.
Yeah.
So just a little bit of background. I'm Associate Director for Technology at ARPA-E, and what ARPA-E is a very small agency at the Department of Energy. We report directly to headquarters, and we're made up of about 15 program directors. We're all on term limits, so we quit our jobs, we go there for 3 to 5 years, do something amazing, and leave and find another job. So it's very, very unusual in the government. The atmosphere is very collaborative. It's sort of a startup-like place because you have to be like that if you're going to accept the level of risk that we accept. So we do riskier things than the rest of the Department of Energy. So we're always thinking about things like, well, okay, we're going to pay money to a bunch of teams to solve a problem. We decide what problems to solve and what those solutions need to look like. We don't do the work. We pay other people to do the work. We're a funding agency. But because it's taxpayer money, we then require people to make these things in the US. And a lot of these things might be high-power electronics. They might be hardware for the grid, things like that. So these are things that maybe not necessarily 5G, but also have things like security issues and supply chain issues. And so as an agency, we think about this a lot. So one of the things that we've been doing recently, which is new, and we actually have an RFI about this, that's already closed, but you can still read it on our Exchange site, is to try to understand how to de-risk some of these technologies that we funded into the manufacturing realm in the US. You're not going to get it for free. You're going to have to pay for it if you want it. And when I think about the amount of money that we actually put towards this problem, it's a very small amount of money considering, the scope of the problem. So as the little funding agency that we are, even we are trying to find ways to put funding vehicles together to attack what we call the second valley of death, which is trying to understand how to scale something up that works in the lab to manufacture it in the US. My background is I come from Dow Chemical and Dow Corning. I'm a person from industry, from very large global corporations. It is very strange to come to ARPA-E where I have to think about things only on the US scale. And I think that's part of where some of this difficulty lies, which is that we're funding technology with taxpayer dollars. We want it manufactured in the US. US competitiveness is sort of in our mission, but we're not a manufacturing agency. We're a high-tech agency to solve energy problems. So you can see why it's a little bit challenging. So I do think that this issue is very important. I work with teams directly that struggle with this all the time in terms of how to do this. So at some point, we sort of have to decide, what do we want? Do we want advanced solutions for the country in energy? If you can't make them here, are we going to fix that problem? Or are we going to change our rules? There's a lot of different things we could do. Now, for 5G in particular, I completely agree with some of the things that you said, which is that people are sort of using the term 5G. It almost feels like as a catch-all for like high-speed internet. I mean, you have to really think about what 5G means, right? It's having low latency, wireless communication. In a lot of places where we're going to have 5G, it's already in places where we have fiber. So, being able to do robotic operations, we can already do that. So you really have to consider where you can have fiber. 5G isn't going to go into rural areas, because why would you use a small cell network that needs a transmitter every 4 blocks when you have houses that are each on 100 acres? You're going to use fiber for that. So I was at a meeting earlier this year that the Post Road Foundation put on at the Harvard Kennedy Center, and it was about how in Maine they're looking at putting fiber broadband to small rural communities, and that if this is handled by the electric utility, the low latency enables the utility to control the grid and balance it better such that it pays for itself. Those are the types of things that I see coming, which honestly don't have anything to do with 5G at all. There are other things that 5G will be useful for, but it's really the latency that matters with that. So we do not have a program in 5G. We have a lot of programs in looking at things like grid management and operation and solutions for the grid.
So that's absolutely fascinating, and you provided the perspective that we wanted, and that is absolutely critical. If you had to highlight a list of, let's say, 4 or 5 critical technologies that you're touching, which are equally, if not more important, and it sounds like they'd be more important than 5G, in terms of the growth, prosperity of this country and of the West in general, please highlight them. Which are those sort of 5, or even a few less if you can't come up with 5, which are absolutely critical and not given enough attention, and maybe where, also a quick word on the US leadership position versus different peers or competitors?
That's a big question. I'm not sure I'll do 5, but I'll
as many as you
certainly
can.
come up with a couple.
Yeah.
One is what I already mentioned, which was grid resiliency and security. That's a really big issue. It's something that we do consider sort of in our purview. We do have some program directors working on that. There are so many problems that need to be solved in that space. And the way that we make decisions to manage the grid it's very old school. And we have a lot more information that we can get to give people to be able to do that smarter. One of the reasons this is important is because we're putting more and more renewables on the grid. And as you put more, especially distributed renewables that might not be managed well, it really unbalances things and makes it more difficult to control. And we actually can start losing a lot more energy. You can start having to build more gas plants because you're going to have, solar that gets interrupted all the time, many times throughout the day that you can't predict. And anyway, the whole thing gets difficult to control. So to me, I think grid technologies are very, very high up there. In terms of this country, I also think power electronics are up there, not just for grid applications, but even charging electric car applications, being able to do that in 10 minutes versus 8 hours. So that's something that people definitely work on. And there's one thing that this is sort of 5G adjacent. It's a different kind of risk. So we've certainly looked at what kind of tech is needed to move autonomous vehicles forward. But we look at it maybe with a different lens than other folks, which is an energy lens. And actually, autonomous vehicles are not necessarily a happy energy story. When you see numbers quoted like, it'll be 40% fewer emissions, they're not taking into account the amount of energy it takes to collect all the data, process all the data, communicate all the data, which can be as much energy as the car is using to drive. So whenever you look at these systems, especially systems that are predicted to explode because of 5G, you need to think about the amount of information that's being used and how it's being computed, and look at that energy as well, because that is not only non-zero, that is actually becoming a really big problem. So I think that 5G actually presents a real risk in terms of more of this invisible energy usage, right, through, things like, code inefficiency and things like that, where people aren't even caring about it, where it can actually be a very large number. And 5G will enable that, and we have to be very careful about that. So when you see numbers quoted about something, ask if that's including the amount of energy that's actually going to be used in the system, including computation. That number might change.
And when you spoke about grid and power, where is the US against its peers?
Well, the US has a real challenge there, right? I mean, because first of all, we were early adopters, which is great if you're early. It becomes much more difficult when you need to go back and fix something. We're huge. We have borders. So we actually have a pretty complex system compared to some other countries. So, when you're looking at, what Germany can do with renewables or something like that, you have to look at what they're doing across their border and how they're able to manage a grid that's newer than ours. So we have a real challenge, which is that we have to serve all of the customers in the US, and a lot of them are rural, and we're still using wires to transmit power, and the whole grid is still connected. So to me, it's really a function of our size, the fact that we have so many different regions, the fact that we have so many different kinds of assets on the grid. It is a particular issue for us.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, come in.
I think there's really an important point here, which is how, in a policy setting, you seek to do something and then you find yourself contradicting yourself on the way back. And just two examples. One of the things that's going to happen in the United States is we funded a lot of rural phone companies to put in equipment. We want them to use the cheapest equipment. Back in the 90s and 2000, fiber, what was the cheapest equipment? Huawei. So now we're going to be funding those very same companies to A, take out all the Huawei equipment, and B, put in somebody else's equipment, but not US. It'll be Ericsson or Nokia. And so we'll be, essentially taxpayers will be paying like 3 times for something because of this security concern. And you're right, it's not really a 5G problem, it's a kind of it's a problem that we have because we don't control, we don't do everything ourselves. But the second thing is, and this goes to a couple of different discussions that we've had here today, you look at AI, you look at robotics, you look at the industries of the future. The United States isn't doing as much as it used to do, and the big companies that are investing the most in that are the very companies that the United States government and a bunch of other states are now looking to break up and make smaller. And so if we think about how the United States is going to succeed in those things, does it really make sense to break up Amazon or Facebook or Google? And I'm not weighing in one side or the other. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that's the real world when you're trying to deal with these issues.
Go ahead, John.
I'll comment for a moment. And I will just say for the record, the last thing that I want to do is anything that sounds defensive of this administration. But, I think that just speaking, sort of looking at it objectively, we're not going to get a technology-directed in any specified level industrial policy out of this administration. But I think this administration would argue, and I would defer to you, Blair, as to whether this resonates with you, but I think they would say that they are doing everything they possibly can that the industry is asking for in helping the facilitation of 5G technology. So is there something that Verizon or AT&T is disappointed in, at least at that level of the value chain, that this administration is not doing to help them, whether that be, and I'm saying this just to facilitate some conversation around this, that is contrary to their interests at the level of taxation, contrary to their interests at the level of regulation. I think these companies are saying, get out of the way and we'll do it. And this administration would say, we're delivering on that, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's really happening. Let me give you an example. the big example, of course, is the tax cut, which was supposed to lead to increased capital investment, and it did not. Instead, it led to an incredible increase in buybacks. And I say this as a Wall Street analyst who thinks, yeah, well, if that's your best use of the money, fine, go ahead and do it. I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm making a predictive judgment. And so when the FCC says, as it did, the telephone company should not have to pay anything beyond the actual cost for access to rights of way, which is what they did. They took about $3 billion out of city coffers that were, used for cops and firemen and stuff like that, and just transferred it to the telephone companies. Did that increase the amount of investment? Not at all. They just did what they did with the tax cut. And they use it for buybacks, or they use it for debt service, or they use it for executive salaries. So the fact that the companies, and look, I'm very sympathetic to AT&T and Verizon. They have a hard job. But I don't think the FCC does stuff that necessarily, the FCC's analysis is if you make it cheaper to deploy in San Jose, they're going to deploy in Bozeman, Montana. That's actually what a commissioner said. That is insane. There is no one on Wall Street, and when I say no one, I really mean no one on Wall Street who believes that. You invest in San Jose on the basis of whether you can get a return. You invest in Bozeman on the basis of whether you get a return. The money does not transfer. There's a number of different uses for the money. So I would argue, and this gets into a number of details, there are a lot of different things. The single biggest thing the government could do to facilitate 5G would be an infrastructure plan that included a lot of 5G deployments into that infrastructure. And the reason why is because infrastructure is something which is nationwide as opposed to simply being in the NFL cities. And the cities are, according to McKinsey, the #2 user of that technology. When you think about waste, sewers, transport, all police and fire, all kinds of uses for it. But actually what the FCC did was make the cities the enemy. And so you actually have these battles now going on in the courts, which totally was preventable. And we could be, I think, in my opinion, moving much faster if you actually had the telephone companies and the cities aligned to achieve certain goals that are actually demand-driven in 5G.
Let's just take this onto a more global level. And obviously at this point in time, there's a lot of questions out there around, first it was ZTE, and now obviously Huawei from the Chinese perspective. How real is this threat in terms of technology supremacy? We have a US-China panel coming up at 2 p.m., which will deal with this in much greater detail. But how advanced are the Chinese or others in these technologies? People tend to forget, but obviously Samsung out of Korea is another big vendor. You have Ericsson out of Sweden. What's the map, if you like, in terms of technical capability? And does it matter? As you said, if 5G isn't as critical as people think, is that how much does it matter? So how real is this current threat and perceived threat, and or how politicized is that? Both of you, if you could. But,
I'll just comment. Well, maybe the substance should come first. I can comment on the politics, but
so go for the politics,
political variable could not be more real. I don't think there's an issue that is where the intensity is any greater than in this particular case, and it is not being driven necessarily by the administration. In fact, I would say that solely. I would say that the restrictions that relate to Huawei and ZTE, are being driven by the broader consensus in the policy ecosystem that these companies are a national security threat. That exists within the Pentagon, that exists on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill, that exists within the stakeholder community. And if anything, if this administration steps back in a way from that national security imperative for the purposes of some kind of breakthrough on a trade deal, then they're going to have a policy forced upon them. So, there is in its lasting too. I think that one thing to recognize is that this is not an issue that's coming up on a tactical or sort of time constrained basis, but this is the conflict around this issue is if anything, it's growing, and it's growing in terms of the ability of U.S. companies to export to China, and it's growing in the basis of U.S. companies being able to use any Chinese technology in the U.S. And the fact that Republicans are leading the way, contrary to sort of the strong pushback from their industry allies, is probably the best reflection of that. So the politics is going to get more adverse, not less, going forward.
Okay, and from a technological or technical perspective, how?
First of all, I agree on the politics, and I would just say, it's not that the technology is that advanced from us. It's simply that due to the way China operates with its industrial policy and the scale at which they're operating, they're going to be cheaper. So, and the more they sell to the rest of the world, whether it's selling to Africa, selling to a lot of other countries, the more they get the benefits of that scale. And that's a real challenge for us. But it's absolutely, it is a security threat, from what I can tell. That's not my area of expertise, but it certainly looks like it.
Yeah, but from actually how good their technology is, have you done any analysis on that?
Well, I wouldn't say their technology is better than their competitors. What I would say is it's cheaper. And that's what creates the problem. Does America want to have 5G that is fundamentally more expensive than our competitors, because that then gets built into the input cost of everything else?
Got it. Jennifer, any perspectives on this?
It really comes down to what price and value do you put on security, and what's really a security issue or not. That's not a question that I can answer. It's also not a question that ARPA-E would answer. We are not a policy agency, nor are we a defense agency. But I do think this is an issue that people need to talk about in really honest terms. And the way that we work is, when we see a problem that needs to be solved, we just completely, as much as possible without bias, super dig into it. We dig into the whole value chain. We dig into who's the manufacturer, who's the customer, who's the user. These might all be different people. And we really try to identify key barriers to adoption of whatever this new technology would be. Sometimes a key barrier might be security. Sometimes it might be policy. So we're not trying to change any of that, but we do look very pragmatically at, okay, what problems can we solve with technology? And so, if we have 3 different pathways available, maybe we take the one that doesn't, run across a bunch of policy issues or whatever. So I think, in this case, I think we really need to better clarify what is really a security issue versus not, how much we're willing to pay for it, and if we think that this is a priority for this country, then we need to pay for it. It's not going to be free.
Okay, I'm with you. Just talk a bit about ARPA-E actually as a model, and how similar it is to DARPA or other similar agencies. And what I'm talking about is how effective you are in interacting with the private sector in particular to catalyze their technological development. This is something where it's a very, it's a great bold idea to have an agency like this, which is, thinking about moonshots, I guess, which probably is the best description, and able to do that. But as you said, you've all got 3 to 5 year terms, so that also is already a time implicit limitation there. But tell us about how you make moonshots go from concept to reality. And you're obviously not the ones to make it reality. You have to interact with the private sector. I think that's really interesting to understand from an innovation ecosystem perspective. You can talk a few minutes on that.
Sure.
The world doesn't know, so tell us more.
One of the big strengths of this agency is, who's our stakeholders? I mean, it's all of the taxpayers of this country, right? We're trying to solve problems for the country. We're not doing new business development to get this widget into another market or something like that. So we have the freedom to talk to anybody we want to talk to. We form communities of people that never would have met or talked to each other to solve a problem, and then we fund them to solve the problem. So many of our project teams are like, maybe it's a small company coupled with a national lab, or a university coupled with a large company, or any combination of all of those things. We talk to everybody. We are free to talk to everybody. And I can't stress enough how important that is, because when you are in industry, you are not free to talk to everybody, and your stakeholder is what's best for the company, not what's best for the country. So I think it's very important to have small agencies like ARPA-E, because we can move quickly. Again, we tolerate a lot of risk. We're very collaborative with each other. We don't compete at all. We have enough money. Thank you, Congress. We have enough money. So it really is the culture and the fact that we're so open and we can analyze a problem to understand what that solution really needs to be. And I think that this is a model that needs to be used more, especially in this country, in terms of funding problems. I would love to see an ARPA for infrastructure. I would love to see an ARPA for manufacturing. I mean, we can have small agencies that don't cost a whole lot of money.
Where would they be housed, by the way? Where would they sit if there was an ARPA? Is there an agency? Is there a department where they would naturally sit? I mean, it's an interesting.
Put it in HUD for infrastructure.
You'd put it
in HUD.
Yeah.
And can't figure it out. They'll just put it in commerce.
Yeah, exactly. But coming back to how you interact with the private sector, you're going to have all these great ideas, but you need entrepreneurs, startups. Yep. You need corporations who are willing to take risk, which is always a question as to whether they are. How do you make that happen? I mean, how do you interact with them? Do you go to them? Do they come to you?
We go to them. We pick up the phone. We hold.
You identify them, and you go. Yeah.
We have a. Each program director has a small team of people, and we just go out there and just viciously find everybody we can possibly find, talk to everybody. We hold some workshops where we very carefully decide who's invited to them so we get a mix and can build a community.
Yeah.
We put out RFIs, requests for information. We put out webinars. We work very hard, actually, to do a lot of aggressive outreach and talk to the people who we need to talk to in order to bring them together. So we have a lot of different tools we can use to do that. It does have to happen relatively quickly in the scheme of things, like you say, because of our time limit. But I think we've done an amazing job at that level of outreach. And some of it is, contacts we bring in with us or our team members bring in, but a lot of it is the fact that people are willing to talk to us, which is a nice feeling. When you're on the other side of the money, people tend to want to talk to you.
Yeah, interesting.
That's
Blair, did you have anything to add to this? You were about to say something there.
No, I think an ARPA-I is a great idea.
And and how do you make that happen?
Well,
is there a will? I mean, is there? It makes sense.
No, your point about Infrastructure Week. It's like one of the easiest way to get a laugh in Washington. Just refer to this as Infrastructure Week. I do think there'll be an infrastructure bill in 2021, no matter who wins the presidency. Okay. And I think that would be a great piece of it. Another piece of it is to make, and this I think would do far more than whatever the FCC has done to drive deployment, which is if you include in every road and every bridge and every sewer that you're funding, basically those elements that make it smart. And the federal government is helping to fund those things. That would help drive a lot more. We were early adopters, but now we have fallen way behind, and that is a huge political challenge.
Anything to add to this, John?
I mean, I would agree with the Blair's notion that an infrastructure bill, while a fantasy in the last few years, becomes more likely for a variety of process and other reasons in 2021. And I go back to the point that I was highlighting, which is that while modest, at least in terms of telecommunications, that is the one area of infrastructure that both sides are willing to be more proactive on, and this will certainly be an element of the whatever infrastructure initiative that we see, in 2021. And whichever party's in charge will probably result in a different multiple in terms of the budget, but it'll be there in some form.
Now, both of you are working actively with investment industry, I believe, hedge funds here and Wall Street here. What is the investor perspective on all of this? And I'm talking the whole spectrum here, from venture capital, private equity, through to multi-strategy, hedge funds, liquid, illiquid, and then obviously the most liquid sort of stock trading. What is the take on this perspective when they're strategizing and they're researching, and what are they thinking about, and how do they perceive this? Do they have a grasp on any of this? Broad question, but been interested to get both your takes. Blair, if you could.
My view is that there is a huge disconnect between the way Wall Street talks about 5G and the way the discussion is inside the Beltway. The critical question on Wall Street for 5G is whether it presents any kind of competitive threat to cable's current dominance of broadband. It is not a big investment story. No one is expecting huge increases in CapEx. There is for Ericsson and Nokia something of a lift. There is with Apple, you look to certain things like the amount of phones that Apple's going to sell this year is probably actually going to be down as people wait for 5G, and so there are definitely like little stories, but in terms of the kind of big story that you saw in the late 90s is everybody got internet ready. You don't see that. It's viewed much more incrementally, whereas, and I agree with you, politically, everybody, the easiest way to get something done is to claim that this will help us with 5G leadership in the world, and it's worked. Politically.
Which may not be a bad thing. If it's a catalyst.
If true, right? The problem is sometimes things happen having very little to do with truth, but I don't see it being a big financial story at this point in time.
Okay. Any views on that, John?
I think I agree. Just as a sort of standalone, actionable thing, it's not a question that arises. I have a very broad-based focus in terms of the policy areas we focus on. Telecommunications is certainly an area within the broader economy where Washington has is a significant variable in investment decisions, and so investors in that respect are looking for more clarity from Washington, which they don't get. But 5G is a theme. I don't sense that it's a standalone investment thesis in any way.
Now, we talked about Ericsson, Nokia, and there's been talk that the US will support them in their aims to be global champions. Is there any likelihood that the US will want to create its own national champion in 5G? And people lazily talk about Qualcomm and others who are, as you know, just part of the supply chain rather than a end-to-end player, and there isn't necessarily an end-to-end player. But is there any, aspiration here to create a national champion which can compete globally? What's the, positioning on that, if you could share?
I'll throw in a comment, and Blair might have a view on this, but I'm not sure that Qualcomm is particularly happy with what Washington has been doing these days, and that it's threatening some of its most important markets overseas. So I think the notion of a national champion, certainly this administration wants to support U.S. companies, U.S. technology, but its policies, at least globally, are more driven on a national security basis, I think.
It's hard to actually know. When you look at some of the comments, there's trade, there's national security, there's there's trade on national. It's some of the comments about Huawei have gone in such bizarre directions. But as far as I know, there has been no credible person saying we need to bring back the network elements or the handset elements back to the United States as a matter of being a national champion. Yeah, we'd like to do it because we'd like more jobs and stuff like that in a kind of generalized sense. And the president has called for Apple to bring certain things back and things like that. But but we don't really have policies designed to do that. There has been an argument that various people in the White House and close to the administration have argued that we need a national network, a wholesale network, to accelerate it. But that idea was largely opposed by industry, by the 3 Republicans on the FCC, and it appears to be going nowhere, but it does keep coming back. Newt Gingrich, Karl Rove, and some others who are close to the administration have keep pushing it. But that's very different than kind of the manufacturing element.
So where are we going to be in 5 years' time, tying up the panel here, in terms of summary, each of you, from a 5G perspective, as in what are the market realities going to be, what will be the penetration in the market? 5G will be I assume, the incumbent technology. It will be widely used. Who will be the main players in terms of manufacturing? Is there a genuine security threat around that, or, as you said, are the mitigating circumstances from taking a wider view as to the supply chain and the integral parts of it? And Jennifer, I'll also allow you to sort of throw in your power and grid technologies there, and thoughts about how this actually implicates other areas such as mobility, transportation, where we should be seeing a convergence moving forward. So perhaps, Jennifer, if you want to sort of start with that, just the whole convergence piece and where you see this going, particularly around electric vehicles. And what did you say, driverless vehicles is a key one I'm sure you're working on.
I think that's a hard question. 5 years is not as far away as it feels like it is sometimes. I do think that distributed sensing is very interesting, but it depends on what you sense and what you do with the information. So I don't like the term Internet of Things. I like, okay, we need to solve this problem, therefore we're going to measure this thing and use these data this way. I do think 5G enables that in some cases because of the low latency. So if you're talking about controlling things, in particular if you're talking about maybe demand response on the grid or something like that, if you need some sort of a low latency connection that's wireless, I think 5G could be a big help in those sort of circumstances. I think that in terms of autonomous vehicles, that's going to be interesting. I mean, there's so many other forces at play there than the technical. I think there's a lot of companies doing a great job trying to bring certain technologies down in cost. But I think there's a really big question there, again, in terms of safety and in terms of how you measure these things, in terms of, are you going to, is everybody in this great unwinning experiment as a human test subject, where those of us that have funded research in those areas know how much paperwork you have to fill out in order to do that. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions that could either help or hamper a lot of this stuff, but I do think that thinking about either low latency 5G or other, again, types of low latency broadband, I think you're going to see a lot of interesting things happen in terms of how we understand and control the grid and how that relates to resiliency. So to me, I mean, honestly, that's one of the biggest things that I think is coming. There's a lot of other ways that you can use distributed sensing to save energy. I started a program called Sensor at ARPA-E about that. But in terms of what you're asking about and in terms of the scope of 5G, I think those are the main
excellent.
things.
John, maybe, and then we'll finish with Blair.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the next 5 years, as far as policy is concerned, the biggest variable is the outcome of the election.
Sure.
In terms of where the emphasis will be in those various buckets that I started my comments with. Will it be a directed, subsidy-oriented strategy? Will it be one that's more generic in nature, that's deregulatory in nature? And then, really the third bucket maybe is the only one I would comment on, which is that the national security bucket, which is that regardless of what the outcome of the election is, there will be emphasis on ensuring that other countries, particularly China, do not develop national champions. They may not be successful, but that is the objective of that strategy. And so on that basis, given how focused the Chinese are on pursuing their own 5G goals, I think inevitably the one conclusion is that we will end up in a bifurcated world in terms of technology standards in this area. So,
Blair?
I agree with that bifurcation. I think that's probably the single most important thing. I would say 5 years from now, the networks delivering 5G will be the same ones that delivered 4G. So it's very incremental.
Yep.
I think the operating systems are likely to still be dominant, the two big operating systems. The big variables on the applications, and that's a little bit more unpredictable, but a lot of the things that are being, when you look at the business community, that is the big concern, that they don't see what the applications are. In the consumer market, in the enterprise market, it's a little more obvious.
Could you articulate what some examples you think the applications will be seeing?
The ones they keep using are robotic surgery, which is insane because you can do that already, as you kind of said, without, and there's no doctor who's going to be doing robotic surgery while driving a car. So it's really a nomadic use, not a, at least I wouldn't want a doctor operating on me while driving a car.
No.
Don't operate and drive, I think is the term. But the, another one that's constantly used is autonomous vehicles, but autonomous vehicles won't be relying on 5G. They'll be relying on internal intelligence features. I will make this prediction that the biggest use of 5G 5 to 10 years from now, and it will be one of the biggest industries everywhere in the world, and one that doesn't exist now or not at scale, is online real-time sports gambling. The ability to bet on every pitch, every play in a football game, every dribble will be huge socially horribly destructive. I don't see how we stop it. It's coming, and the technology makes it possible in a way.
Yeah.
And that it's funny to me because in these conferences I go to, I keep saying to the telephone guys, well, this is such an obvious use case. Why don't you talk about it? It's obvious why they don't want to talk about it. They shouldn't want to talk about it. But that's, I think it's uses like that that'll probably be driving more activity than what we're currently talking about.
And just briefly coming back again to the Chinese angle, well, I mean, Huawei is, one sees is going to be locked out completely from the US. So US...
That's not 100%.
Or is that not 100% the case? So are we going to...
Not 100%, but that's the most likely scenario. I completely agree.
And some of the
Western...
Western...
US thing will be...
Yeah.
That's the next 25 years will be...
So there's going to have to be homegrown technology to fill the gaps, to create this, or it's already there, it just needs to be structured.
European or others.
Yeah, from sort of Western ally.
Yeah.
I mean, one interesting thing, and just quickly with Jennifer on this, is that this was actually a global dream from London. The former Minister of Defence of the UK, Sir Michael Fallon, said people aren't thinking about this, and he did the 5G panel in London, that, for example, wind turbines are predominantly made in China by the Chinese, and this is going to be one of the key renewable energies of the future. We assume once fossil fuels run out and the rest of it, and they have control of that. And that's one example which is very, very serious, and it's not being given any strategic attention at this point in time, as far as we can see. Maybe John can inform slightly different.
Hates wind turbines, but for some other reason we're not clear about.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
but it's
but he actually has discussed it multiple times. He does not like wind turbines.
Okay.
They cause cancer and kill birds.
Yeah, but I mean, as an example, that there are these things which are getting lost in the discussion. And okay, this isn't necessarily 5G, but this is more about the manufacturing sovereignty. Jennifer, just quickly on this, do you see this? Are you coming across technologies which are absolutely core to the future of multiple industries, but obviously energy-centric in your view, whereby you are shocked how the US or the West are just not leading the way, and that where if we don't get our act together, we're going to be completely outsourcing these industries and the technology and its mastery to other nations, some of which are friends and others of which aren't. Quick take on that, and then we'll sum up.
I mean, I do think people are talking about it. That rare materials as well. I mean, when you're talking about supply chain,
sure,
right?
Absolutely.
Talking about how many materials you need for electronics, and that comes up every few years, and I do think there's going to be a renewed focus on that. So I do think it's important. I think people talk about it. I think sometimes the question is, well, we could make it here, but it's going to be way too expensive. So it comes down to that cost question again, where maybe your backup is, okay, it's going to take this many years to get up to speed on what we need, and it's going to cost 3 times as much, maybe. I don't know. It's definitely something people should talk about. The answer may not always be everything has to be made here, because I think that that's probably not something that's realistic, but it is something that we always need to consider. And I've seen people in labs before that are working on making a new type of solar cell or something, and they're using material. And I said, well, okay, if we scale that up to the amount of solar we want in the country, you will literally use 3 times more than that exists on Earth. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to use that material. It's not that it's not interesting scientifically, but there is a giant barrier there that you didn't even think about. So the more we get this in the conversation, and thank you for inviting us here today, because I think it's important for people to talk about this type of thing.
Yeah.
We just need to talk about it. People need to ask the questions. Investors need to ask the questions, and we need to really sort of quantify that in terms of how much of a risk is it really.
Yeah, and to come together and act on that. Excellent. Well, thank you so much to the panelists for a very vibrant, fascinating discussion. I think you will agree that it was very carefully selected, a very eclectic mix. And thank you so much on what was a sunny day in New York City, but which is now turned rainy. But coming from London, we expect that. So anyway, thank you so much, and we will reconvene in just over half an hour for our grand US-China tech supremacy panel. Networking break ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much.